Welcome everybody. My name's Sue Sentence. I'm from the Raspberry Pi Foundation. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the, I think it's the 5th in our series of seminars on AI education for young people. And we're delighted today to introduce you to Dave Touretzky and Fred Martin, who are going to talk to us about teaching artificial intelligence in K-12. This series is presented in partnership with the Alan Turing Institute in the UK. We're delighted to be presenting this together. The format that we have for every seminar, we have in a moment, Dave and Fred will start their presentation. They'll talk to us for about 35-40 minutes, and then we'll divide into breakout rooms so everybody can have an opportunity to discuss the seminar and come up with some questions. Then we'll come back for some general Q&A, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have. Dave and Fred, can we talk to us about teaching artificial intelligence in K-12? Dave is a research professor at Carnegie Mellon University and also the founder and chair of the AI4K12 initiative that they'll be talking about today. Fred is a professor of computer science at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell, and was a founding member of the AI4K12 initiative steering committee. I'm really looking forward to hearing about it. And I've just found out that they have been awarded I've got to get this right, the Triple AI EAI, is that right? Outstanding Educator of the Year Award for 2022. So Dave Touretzky, Fred Martin, and their two colleagues jointly awarded. So that's fantastic achievement.
Thank you so much for inviting us to speak with you today. I'm Dave Touretzky, and I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Fred Martin.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fred Martin. You can see my title on the screen. It's so wonderful to be here with all of you. This is such a great and big international audience. I'm really looking forward to us sharing today. Thank you all for being here.
Great. So let us first start by telling you about AI4K12.org. We were founded in 2018 with 3 goals. The first is to develop national guidelines for teaching AI in K-12. National, because it's hard enough to try and get 50 states to agree on anything, would be much harder to get other countries to agree. So it's not that we're not interested in teaching AI outside of the US, and a lot of groups are looking at our work, but we're not so presumptuous as to think we could tell other countries what they should do. They'll find their own solutions. Our guidelines are modeled after the CSTA standards, CSTA being the Computer Science Teachers Association. They publish national standards for teaching computing in K-12, but those standards say very little about AI, and that's what sparked the need for this initiative. Like the CSTA standards, our standards are divided into 4 grade bands. We're trying to define what students should know and what they should be able to do. Our second goal is to develop a resource directory specifically for the K-12 audience. So how do you find the best videos, the best websites, and so on? We've been doing that. You can see our resource directory at AI4K12.org. And thirdly, we're working on building a community of K-12 AI resource developers, researchers, and practitioners.
So this is the group of us who Sue mentioned at the top of our chat that will be co-awarded the Outstanding Educator of the Year. We're very delighted by the recognition, and also by giving our project more visibility. So along with Dave and myself, Professor Christina Gardner-McCune, who's associate professor at the University of Florida, is co-chair of the project, and Deborah Seahorn, who was she was chair of CSTA. She was also an interim executive director of CSTA, and she was the lead of the CSTA standards projects, which spanned 2 decades. So these are the 4. We're the group that did the organization. Next slide, Dave. And the key thing we did was bring together a group of working members, and many of whom are practicing K-12 teachers in the classroom who have direct experience with their students and bringing ideas like these to our students. You can see, as Dave alluded, that we organized ourselves into 4 grade bands in the development of our guidelines. So this was the group that did all the work.
So one of the first things we did was we released a list of 5 big ideas in AI. And this was inspired by CSTA, which has a 5 big ideas in computing. This serves as the organizing framework for the guidelines that we've gone on to develop. 5 big ideas are enough to cover the richness of the field, but not too many, so people get confused. CSTA found 5 was a good number. And so that's how we ended up with 5. It's not necessarily the way that AI practitioners would view the field, but we found it a good way to explain the field to a K-12 audience. So after we released this list of 5 big ideas, and Fred's going to go through them in a minute, one of our teachers on the working group suggested that we make a poster that she could put up in her classroom to explain the 5 big ideas. So we did that. You can download this poster from AI4K12.org. And it's not only good for putting up in K-12 classrooms, it's also very useful for handing out to members of Congress. So we've done some of that, meeting with congressmen or congressional aides, senatorial aides, and being able to give someone one single sheet of paper that tells them what AI is about turns out to be quite helpful. So these 5 big ideas really took off. People seemed to like them, and spontaneously started translating them into other languages. So they're now available in 17 languages, as you see listed here. So now that I've built up some mystery about them, we're gonna explain. Fred's gonna take you through the 5 big ideas.
Thanks, Dave. So big idea number 1 is perception, the idea that computers perceive the world using sensors. And the key idea of perception is it's sensory data, and it's the extraction of the meaning from the sensory signals. So next slide, Dave. So we have 2 slides per big idea, and what we're going to focus on in unpacking each one of the big ideas is what should students be able to do. And this is really at the heart of developing the guidelines, is these action statements. What should students at different grade bands be able to do to engage with the big idea? So for example, and I'm going to be highlighting the ones that are in boldface. So at the earliest grade band, students should be able to identify what are sensors on things like computers, robots, and intelligent appliances. We actually have the grade band lead for the K2 here on the call, Vicki Cedric. Vicki, I'm going to call you out because you were so influential and had made such contributions. Vicki, would you talk about the idea of what kids at that age are really just grappling with their own understanding of how we work as people?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Vicki Sedgwick. I am a elementary CS teacher in Los Angeles. So in the early grades, a lot of times we're still dealing with reality versus non-reality with these kids, and everything seems like magic to them. So for us, it's like, let's understand how human senses work, and then how that computer seems to see you, and identify, oh, we have 5 senses. Well, how do machines take in data from the world? So it's a great tie-in. And if anybody's familiar with Linda Lucas's work, she does a great job with identifying computers, and it's a great extension to one of her books to talk about sensors with the kids. It's making it not magic. We want them to realize that it's not magic. It really is just hardware that's bringing this data into the computer.
Thanks, Vicki. Thank you. So the next grade band, grades 3 to 5, which is 9 to 11 years old. Students could actually make some sort of app that uses perception. So for example, they could have a plugin to Scratch, or they can use the Calypso system, which is a tool that Dave has been leading the development on. Moving to the next grade band, 6 to 8, that students can recognize that perception systems draw on multiple algorithms as well as multiple sensors. So it's not just one at a time. And an example of something students can do at the upper grade band is thinking through speech recognition and understanding this idea of homophones, explaining how homophones, the words that sound alike but are different words, how a speech recognition system addresses that by connecting all the meaning together. Yeah, next slide, Dave. So big idea number 2 is representation and reasoning. And so the idea here is that agents, AI systems, build representations of the world, and then reasoning is acting on these representations. So reasoning are algorithms that act on the representations. Next slide. So an example of what students should be able to do at the very early grades, draw a map, which becomes a representation. At the upper elementary, design a representation, for example, of an animal classification system and perhaps using a tree structure. At grades 6 to 8, design a model of their home and then apply the reasoning algorithm to determine the shortest path. So actually use the representation and have an algorithm operate on it. And a more advanced version of that, the high school level, could be drawing the search tree for a tic-tac-toe game. Yeah. Next slide. So big idea 3 is all about learning, machine learning, that computers can learn from data. Next slide. So for example, at the earliest grade band, students could look for patterns in data and learn from them with unplugged activities, so things that don't use the computer. At the next step, students could use some of the, for example, machine learning for kids, .co.uk, that wonderful system that connects Scratch to IBM Watson. So kids could actually train a model using a system like that. At the next grade band, we are introducing the idea of bias and having students think through about how the training set can cause or mitigate bias. And at the upper grade bands, we imagine introducing neural nets, for example, with a tool like TensorFlow Playground. And again, the emphasis is on kids actually making things using these AI tools, as well as understanding them. Next slide. Big idea 4, I think this is one that Dave was really passionate about highlighting, is that AI is about human computer interaction that's natural, that's comfortable, becomes part of our world. And I think Dave pointed out this phrase that humans are among the hardest things for AI agents to understand. And so let's look at some of the things that kids can do with this idea. And so this the grade K2 one, this is one that Vicky really introduced to us, that at that age, students are just learning to understand facial expressions in people. So that would be an ideal thing to highlight, that's what computers would be doing as well. That's what AI is doing, is taking the same input and recognizing it. At the grade 3 to 5 band, thinking about how humans combine multiple inputs in order to understand communication. At grade 6 to 8, students can actually do things like make a chatbot. And at the upper grade band, to start to think about how does AI and consciousness, how can those ideas be brought together? Next slide. And so big idea 5 is about societal impact. And if you think back to the visual that Dave was showing before we dove in, that's in the center of the graph, because AI connects with everything in society and can have both positive and detrimental impacts. Next slide. So ways of engaging students to think about how AI affects our world. At the earliest grade band, students can identify AI applications that they encounter in their daily lives. Starting at the next grade band, we're asking students to identify ways that AI systems can be designed for inclusivity. At the middle school level, understanding how trade-offs in AI systems, how those decisions can have unintended consequences in the function of a system. And then at the high school level, having students design an AI system that addresses a social issue, or maybe just explain it, but ideally if students can actually build something, that would be what we hope for. Dave, back to you.
Okay, so we thought about some things that we need to do to support K-12 students in learning AI. And these are, sometimes they're easier said than done. So one thing we would really like to have is transparent AI demonstrations, what we call glass box models, so that they can see what's going on under the hood. Not all demonstrations are glass box, and there's sort of a trade-off. So the black box models, they can do more impressive things, but how they work is a mystery. The glass box models that people can see inside of are often limited in what they can do, but what they are doing is actually visible. So for example, Teachable Machine is a wonderful demo from Google that allows even young kids to train a visual classifier. And this can be done in just a few minutes. It can use the webcam on the laptop, but it's entirely black box. You can't see what's happening inside the demo. So that's still, it's very effective. It's a very useful teaching tool. On the other hand, you can't see anything. So I have a demo that we've released of a face recognition system where we actually let you see what the individual neurons in the neural net are doing. You can visualize some of the layers of the neural net. And that's a glass box demo. So you can hold things up to the camera and see how different parts of the neural net respond. On the other hand, you can't teach it new things. So there's this trade-off, and we need both kinds of demos. We want to help students build mental models of what's going on under the hood so that they have ways of thinking about what could be happening, even if in some circumstances they can't see under the hood. And we think it's really important that students be able to develop their own AI applications. There's a growing number of tools, things like plugins for Scratch, for MIT App Inventor, and also specific, purpose-specific tools like the Calypso software that I'll talk about a little later, that are specifically targeted at the K-12 market to allow kids to create AI applications. So it's important to experiment with existing systems, teach them ways to do these experiments, let them build their own applications. We want to have them explore case studies of societal issues. So for example, Tesla is treating the population of the US as unpaid guinea pigs. They're sending self-driving cars running around the highways, whether you like it or not. And there are some ethical questions about whether this is okay. So there's lots of ways to relate these AI concepts to things that are going on right now, because AI is so pervasive in our society. It's not science fiction anymore. It's showing up all over the place in our, AI controls our Facebook feeds. We deal with voice response systems. So we're living in an AI permeated world. So let me move on to another topic, which is AI thinking. You've probably heard many talks now about computational thinking and how that's a good thing. And we agree that that's a good thing. But I want to suggest that there's another kind of thinking to be interested in, and that's what I call AI thinking. So just a quick review of computational thinking if you're not familiar with it. Here's a nice poster that was put out by a UK group, Barefoot Computing, that talks about, on the left-hand side here, you see the major concepts in computational thinking. So these are the kinds of things that we want students to be familiar with, even at a young age. things like problem decomposition, breaking a problem down into parts, abstraction, the idea that you could focus on the essential elements of a problem and remove unnecessary detail, thinking algorithmically, the idea that you break a solution down into steps that can be made explicit. So these are all the concepts that computational thinkers work with. But there's also a set of what are sometimes called dispositions or attitudes. So things like tinkering, the idea that you can change things and see what happens and gain insight by doing that. The notion of debugging, that if things don't work the way you want, you can reason about what's going on and eventually discover and correct the source of the error. Perseverance is very important. Anybody in the computing field knows that. Your programs don't work the first time, usually. So these are a set of dispositions that turn out to be valuable, not just for doing well in computing classes, but for doing well in school, especially in STEM fields. This is just a part of the mental toolkit that we agree we want all children to have. So that's computational thinking. We can compare that now against AI thinking. So computational thinking is a bit lower level. It's more the nuts and bolts of building computational solutions. And AI thinking, I would claim, works with a higher level, more abstract set of concepts and skills. So thinking about perception, not just sensing, thinking about reasoning and representation, which doesn't necessarily mean being able to build a Python or JavaScript data structure, certainly not in the younger ages, but just thinking about what is the reasoning algorithm doing, or what kind of representation would be needed to support this intelligent behavior. Machine learning is a tool that students can use. They don't have to master the calculus of deep neural networks. They just need to understand what a training set is and how you measure generalization. Language understanding, autonomous robots, these are the levels that we want kids to think about as AI thinkers, not necessarily taking it down to the level of executable code. So AI thinking extends computational thinking. Of course, AI is built on representation and reasoning. We know that representations ultimately have to be data structures, which are abstractions. We know that reasoners are algorithms. So we're drawing on the same concepts and dispositions of computational thinking, but a difference is that AI asks students to think of computation as being thinking. Not all computations, but computation can actually be thinking. You can build something that is a reasoner, that reasons. And it's exactly what humans need when they try to understand how machines can think. So I want to give some examples of what this looks like in practice. Let's take visual perception. So children today are growing up in a world where computers can see. And here's an example, Google Lens. If you are running Google Lens on your smartphone and you point it at a dog, it not only knows that it's a dog, it'll tell you the breed, it'll tell you some interesting facts about the breed. And so the dispositions that we want children to have is, I can teach a computer to recognize what I want it to see. I can make artifacts that use computer vision. It used to be you had to be a PhD in AI to say something like that. And now any 8-year-old who's used teachable machine can truthfully make these statements. When children get to the high school level, we want them to have some appreciation for the complexity of visual understanding. So here you see a picture of how a self-driving car sees the world. It recognizes vehicles, pedestrians, traffic lights, traffic signs, what part of the road it's allowed to drive on, that's the green part, what part it's not supposed to be driving on, that's the red part. How does it do this? So this is what I call the abstraction pipeline. You start with raw pixels, and we work through this very complex hierarchy of increasingly abstract things, ending up with scenes at the end. So this is a way of thinking about visual perception. It used to be the way vision algorithms were coded. Each one of these little boxes would be a module probably written in C. And these modules would communicate, they would share data structures. Nowadays, it's often not done this way. It's done with a deep neural network, although it's not entirely done that way. So there is a call for this, but even if it's done by a deep neural network, if you try to understand what this neural network is doing, it's doing stuff like this. It's decomposing the scene into its components and recognizing these components. The same thing for speech. Kids are growing up in a world where it's perfectly normal to talk to a machine, and in fact, the machine will answer you back. And so you can say something like, Fred referenced homophones before. If you say to Google, they're building their new house over there, these 3 instances of there are different words, and Google will get it right. It's very hard to fool Google with homophones. It's been very well engineered. So the disposition we want kids to have is, I can make artifacts that understand voice commands. So that they can say that truthfully when they're very little, when they're very young. By the time they get to high school, we would like them to have this appreciation for the complexity of what's going on under the hood, that you start with the waveform and you proceed through all these levels of representations, the spectrogram, sounds, stems and affixes, syntax, and then finally semantics. And we can make these things transparent to students. There are some really good demos online, not for all of this yet, but for parts of this. There are online demos that we can use to teach children. Representation is another example. So as Fred mentioned, you can teach even kindergartners what a representation is by using maps. They can understand a map of their house. Things like game boards are examples of maps. As children get older, they can learn about things like trees, graphs, and feature vectors. So these are data structures. They don't necessarily have to be able to code this. In the later grades, of course, they'll learn something about coding this. But even in the very young grades, they can draw these things on the blackboard and they can reason about them. So this disposition of an AI thinker, that I can make representations and manipulate them, we want them to have that view of the world from a very young age. Here's an example I like to show. This was taken in my friend Ruse's Tesla. So we're driving down the street, and here's a car in front of us. There's a truck in the next lane in front of us, and the Tesla is showing you its representation of the world. So we say that AI systems build representations of the world. Well, here's the Tesla's representation of the world. Here's the car in front of us. The truck is over here. There's a car behind us that we can't see, but the Tesla has cameras facing backwards, so it can. So this is what a real self-driving car's representation of the world looks like. And here is a representation of the world in my Calypso system, which uses the Cosmo robot. If you haven't seen Cosmo, this is what Cosmo looks like. So some people call it a little self-driving car that fits in the palm of your hand. And so we're showing you here the robot's camera view of the world. These cubes are the robot's toys. Here's a wall with a doorway in it. And the robot has built a map of the world using its computer vision. You can see where the robot is. It knows where its toys are. It knows where the wall is. It does speech recognition. It has rules, when-do rules that it uses to control its behavior. And so, and we've used this as early as 3rd grade. So kids can use a programming framework that combines computer vision, speech recognition, path planning, object manipulation. Calypso is inspired by Microsoft's Code Game Lab, by the way, and it's a tool specifically for teaching AI thinking. There's a free simulator version. If you don't have a Cosmo robot, you can go to calypsorobotics.com and you can do it right now. You can run Calypso and experiment with it. One more example is learning. So computers can learn from data. Here's something that even many adults misunderstand about machine learning. Machine learning, at least the supervised learning, what machine learning is doing is constructing a reasoner. So the machine learning algorithm itself is not doing the reasoning, it's building a reasoner. And then the reasoner's job is to produce the desired outputs given inputs. So we supply training data to the algorithm, and the machine learning algorithm uses the training data to adjust the internal representations of the reasoner that it's manipulating. And what that looks like depends on the flavor of reasoner that you've chosen. So if you want a decision tree, the learning algorithm will manipulate the decision tree by adding nodes to it typically. If you've chosen a neural network style of reasoner, the machine learning algorithm manipulates the reasoner by adjusting its weights. So we want children to understand this. In fact, we need adults to understand this because they frequently don't. And the disposition is that I can use machine learning to train a reasoner, right? Even kids in 3rd grade can say that truthfully if they use some of these online tools. Here is Dale Lane's Machine Learning for Kids. This is a collection of resources that includes a decision tree learner. Dale has a book out based on the website. The website is machinelearningforkids.co.uk. I'm sorry that we left that off the slide here. But this is an example of a decision tree visualized. So he turned this from a black box to a glass box demo because you can actually see the decision tree that the system has learned. Fred's now going to tell you about the future.
We're almost there with the presentation. So so I'm going to share some of the work that's been going on as these ideas are, as we finish the big ideas, 5 big ideas framework and started to share our work. Dave and Christina set up a series of workshops called State of K-12 AI Education in your state, across the states of the United States, to create local groups in each of the states or many of the states to start developing plans for bringing AI to that state. As many of you will know, the United States has a distributed education system where each state ultimately decides its education standards informed by national conversations, but it is a state-by-state process. So this work mirrors the process that was set up to bring computing standards across the United States. Next slide, Dave. And then there have been education efforts worldwide. And so here are some of the ones that we're aware of. In China, there's a mandate that all students will learn about AI, and they're working on the standards. In South Korea, they've just launched a new national curriculum that includes AI in their recently developed computer science standards across K-12. And Deborah and I actually created a presentation very similar to this one that was shared at their national conference just last month. At the UK, the Computing at School team is advocating for AI education. And of course, a big part of all of these efforts is teacher professional development. That's essential in order for this work to be realized. And we understand that there's work going on in the EU as well. Yeah, and I think that's it. Next slide, Dave.
Is that, yeah, that's the one.
Can we go to the acknowledgement slide to just show that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we want to highlight the groups that came together to carry out this work. So the AI for K-12 initiative is a joint initiative of AAAI and the Computer Science Teachers Association. Dave led the writing of an NSF grant, which was funded and supported much of this work. And Dave's institution, Carnegie Mellon, also directly contributed to this project.
I should mention that we've received new NSF funding for a project called AI for GA. We're developing a curriculum for Georgia middle school students. It's a 9-week AI elective. We just started piloting that last week in 5 teachers in Georgia, and that work will be made public. So we'll be rolling out this curriculum publicly once we've gone through the first pilot. So we've moved from pure guideline development to actually implementation by developing a curriculum. But there are many other groups who are also developing curriculum materials targeting different grade bands. And there is a community. So we encourage you, if you're interested, to join our community. You can visit AI4K12.org. You'll find the Big Ideas poster there. You'll find drafts of the first 3 guidelines. So for each of the 5 big ideas, we've been developing guidelines in the form of a grade band progression chart. So this chart has columns for the 4 grade bands, K-2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, and 9 to 12. And the rows are the various concepts and subconcepts that make up that big idea. And then every cell in this chart is what students should know about that subconcept in their grade band and what they should be able to do with it. So the first 3 big ideas, the grade band progression charts, are publicly available on the website. We are very close to releasing the chart for big idea 4, and we hope to have big idea 5 out also fairly soon. We do have a mailing list, and you don't have to memorize this long URL. If you just go to AI4K12.org, at the bottom of the web page is a link to join the mailing list. It's low traffic, high quality, and it's full of interesting resources. People post resources, relevant news stories, and so on. So there is a growing community. We have a special track at the EAAI conference. So EAAI is Educational Advances in Artificial Intelligence. We have a track there on tools and resources for teaching AI in K-12. That conference will be in February. They've unfortunately had to go remote. It was originally going to be in Vancouver, but now it's going to be remote. So if you're interested, that's another venue. You could learn about interesting work and meet like-minded people by participating in that meeting. And I think that takes us to our allotted time.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. Can we give a big jazz hands, Raspberry Pi jazz hands to the speakers? Thank you very much. Fantastic presentation. Really enjoyable, and already in the chat, people saying how much they've enjoyed it. Now, before we break off into our breakout rooms, I think Fred and Dave suggested some questions that you might want to talk about in your, of course you don't have to. So these are some of the questions that they have talked about, that they suggested to us. You could talk in your groups around, we are starting to see, well, do you want to read the questions out, Fred or Dave? These are your questions.
Sure. We're starting to see AI-powered computer vision and speech recognition capabilities in children's toys. And how do you think this will affect the way they reason about computing? So that's one question. Another one, many kids are growing up today talking with Alexa. In fact, when we first started giving talks about AI for K-12, we often got pushback from people who said, why do we need to teach AI in kindergarten, right? Why can't that wait, at least till undergraduate, if not graduate school? And our reply was that by the time these kids get to kindergarten, they've spent 2 years talking to Alexa. So we're not introducing them to AI in kindergarten. They've already met AI. We're just trying to get them to understand what's going on. But 20 years from now, what do you think children will be growing up with? It's not just going to be Alexa. What do you think they'll be growing up with that we're going to have to deal with as educators? A third question is that advocates of AI education like to say that AI is the new electricity. AI is the 4th industrial revolution, and it's the new electricity that's powering this 4th industrial revolution. But and so you need to teach AI for the same reason that you teach electricity in school. But I just wonder, how much does the average child really know about electricity other than don't stick your hand in the light socket? So do they need to understand AI better than they understand electricity? And why, why would you make the argument for or against that? And then finally, what new tools would you like to see created to help students learn about AI? We're always looking for suggestions for things. In fact, we have money to develop these tools. So that would be very helpful if people came up with some ideas for us.
That's great. So those are some possible questions, but you can also talk about anything else that's come up in for you in the seminar. So I think Diana's going to divide us into groups, and we'll come back in about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll have a big group discussion with Dave and Fred. Welcome back to the big room. Thanks again to Fred and Dave for that great talk, and hopefully you've had fantastic discussion in your, I've got to find the chat now, in your breakout rooms. And I'll just, while I'm waiting for you to write your questions in, I'll just start off with my question. Quick question to Dave and Fred. So we've heard a lot about concepts and ideas and activities. Obviously, I'm quite interested in teachers. Can you talk a little bit about your experience of how teachers respond to teaching AI in your experience in the US?
We think that teacher professional development is crucial to making this work. You know, it's hard just to find qualified computer science teachers in the US. There aren't enough of them. You know, there's many states are adopting goals that all their high schools, for example, should offer a computer science elective. And yet, in most states, fewer than 50% of the high schools do that, have any computer science course at all. And it's partly because it's hard to find qualified teachers. So for AI education, we're at least 10 years behind where we are for computing education. Just providing people opportunities to learn about this material themselves is a really important thing that we've been thinking about. We do give professional development workshops at conferences, things like the CSTA conference, the 6E conference, but this needs to scale up. We need to have larger teacher professional development efforts. One of the things we're doing in our AI4GA project, besides developing a middle school elective for Georgia students, is we're also funded to develop a teacher professional development course that will be delivered online and made available through the Georgia Department of Education in a hope that we can scale up teacher PD so that it can be done at a national scale. Obviously, Fred, Christina, Deborah, and I, we can't just go around the country giving seminars. There aren't enough of us to do that single-handedly. There are other groups also doing teacher PD. So ISTE, for example, the International Society for Technology and Education, they have an online teacher PD course that runs over several months. They have weekly meetings, assignments, and so on. So, and hundreds of teachers. Last time we checked with them, I think they're up to something like 1,000 teachers now have been through their course. So there are other groups working on this problem, but it's certainly a significant obstacle that has to be overcome. We have to give teachers access to good materials and opportunities to become comfortable teaching AI.
I think another dimension of it is having AI connect with the existing learning goals that are part of school curricula, because we want it to be integrated so it feels that it's supporting the learning that the teachers are already expected to deliver. And particularly at the lower grades, an integration approach is really the only way it feels like we'll actually be able to reach as many kids as we want.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And we have now lots of questions coming up for you. I've got a little list. So Jonathan, do you want to start with your question? And then after that, I'll go to Jane and her group.
It's just, well, I come from a particular perspective. So I'm going to say, you know, I've got my bias, let's put it that way. I was really interested in the societal impact. And really, it's that kind of question that I want to get out there first, because, okay, it's very well learning about the nuts and bolts of something. But if we're not, in a strange kind of way, if we, as AI is exploding now in a positive way in the universe and blah, 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 is that actually the kids, have, as you've already said, are fairly literate in terms of how it's used and where it's used and what it does, you know, not in terms of what it does in microscopy, but actually getting them to consider the implications of it is really important. And also where the power lies in terms of who owns it, how it's distributed, where the money is, you know, all of these things, you know, who has access, who doesn't have access, how does that, you know, does that polarize things? So all of the societal, economic and political impacts of it. And so I was wondering whether you've approached politics teachers, philosophy teachers, ethics teachers, not just IT teachers, and try and embed it in different aspects of the curriculum as well, really.
I think that's a great idea. We don't have any specific efforts in that area yet, but that's certainly, I think that's, the second group of teachers we should probably be approaching. There's a lot of discussion about the ethics of AI that really applies more broadly than that. So just as a society, we're becoming conscious of the broader effects of engineered systems. And they don't necessarily have to be AI systems, but anything that you make that affects people's lives. We're starting to have some standards about, well, did you think about how this affects different groups of people? Are you serving all groups equally well, or is your solution only going to be good for some groups? And this goes far beyond AI. So you see it in different kinds of medical decision-making, in all kinds of administrative systems. And I think engineering education is starting to change to incorporate those kinds of considerations. So even though AI has received a lot of attention for these issues, it's not so much an AI issue as it is a technology issue. And so I'm happy to share that spotlight with other people who may be developing engineering curricula, say, or general STEM curricula, right? So even things like, what's your vaccination policy, right? And how are you treating different socioeconomic groups who may have different access to vaccines? Nothing to do with AI, but it's the same kind of socially conscious thinking that has arisen in the last few years that we just never saw 20 years ago.
Thank you. There's a few questions of a similar theme coming on in the chat around sort of digital divide and access to AI and that sort of thing. Jane, I think you were the first person to put this in the chat. Do you want to ask that question from your group?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to my group, and I wanted to also say thank you to Fred and Dave. I thought it was a fabulous presentation and so impressed with everything that you've done. I think it's really principled and it's just excellent. Anyway, my group were amazing. I felt like I was in some kind of working group, so Vicky Sedgwick kind of working group. But what was great was we were thinking about this whole idea of the digital divide and what was actually making the divide. And we kind of were saying, well, it could be about the hardware, it could be about, whether you've got access to the apps. But then we were talking about teachers, which went exactly to what Sue said. And we were talking about, well, teachers are so busy and they're scared of normal computer science. So this idea of AI. So do you think the digital divide will actually get wider? Because there are those students, if they don't have the resources at home and they don't have clubs that they go to, or parents who are into tech, and they don't have the schools, it could actually pull it further apart. So that's our question to Fred and Dave.
I think it is a real concern, and thank you, Jane. I have an NSF project right now that's working with 3 school districts to bring just computer science to the middle schools, and particularly now, it's just incredibly difficult for teachers to create time for something new, and exactly what you said about just fear and teachers being overwhelmed. And so I do think that it is a real hazard that AI, for it to not be perceived as yet another thing. So that's why, as much as possible, connecting it with things we already know is so important, and realizing that we do have a lot of ways of thinking about how we work. And this is some of the work that Vicky again brought to our project, really reflecting on what are the standards that are already in place and how AI can connect them. I think that's our best strategy. And another piece of it is that we don't have to teach programming in the way that learning computer science, you do have to teach those nuts and bolts. A lot of AI can be learned by thinking through implications, as Dave was saying, and building on the question about Jonathan's question about ethics. These are things that affect all parts of our world. It's not only AI. So I think there are ways of bringing AI in that take into account this concern.
It sounds like teaching by stealth. We've got to kind of sneak it in to what's already there. But thank you, that's a great answer.
Let me just take a more optimistic view. I think that the danger of the digital divide is lessening because hardware is becoming so cheap. And a lot of things, it can be accessed even from a cell phone. And so even people who are not wealthy and have fancy desktop computers at home, they have a cell phone. Everybody has a smartphone now. One of the criteria for developing AI demos that we've taken on is that it has to run in the browser, right? So we want this thing to be as widely available as possible. And so when you make software that anybody can run in a web browser, that means that people who are interested can get access to these materials. We also, in our resource guide, we have links to lots of really excellent videos there that people can watch on their own time at their own pace, and they can learn. So I'm kind of optimistic that the digital divide is going to solve itself by just the wider spread adoption of better hardware. You buy the better cell phone because you want to watch movies, but besides watching movies, you can also teach yourself AI or quantum physics or whatever you want to learn about.
Lovely. I've got, I think we'll go to Julie next for her question about Unplugged. And then after that, we'll go Saman and then Callum, who've got questions. You asked a question in the chat, Julie, about Unplugged activities.
Oh, yes.
The value of those that have seemed to come up from your group.
Yes.
So
the digital divide, one way that you can overcome that, where you don't need all the expensive hardware, is through Unplugged. And so how does, you mentioned those 4 age bands, so elementary, middle, high school. How would Unplugged be seen in those? What would you expect to see in a classroom in middle school, high school, in terms of unplugged experiences with AI?
Well, I can give you an example that we're actually implementing right now. So we wanted to teach students about breadth first search and about how self-driving cars work. So since this is a class for students in Georgia, we gave them a map of Georgia with 20 major cities. And we showed how to represent that map as a graph with nodes and links. And then we showed them how to do route finding. So if you want to get from Atlanta to Savannah, you can do that by applying a simple graph coloring algorithm. And this can be done on the blackboard or pencil and paper. So you do this graph coloring algorithm, and that introduces them to breadth first search. And then it turns out that if instead of coloring the graph, you can draw this thing called a search tree. And we show them how to expand the nodes in the tree level by level. And that's equivalent to coloring the graph. So all of this is done unplugged. And then, we can point out that this is the same kind of search that a computer would do to investigate moves in a tic-tac-toe game or solve other kinds of combinatorial search problems. And then, of course, we give them another pair of cities and say, now you do it. Now you show us, you build the search tree to go from Warner Robins to Brunswick. And so they're actually doing AI, but they're doing it without needing a computer.
I say thank you for that, because you've also identified there the links between other parts of computing, so algorithms. I was thinking about the way that messages travel over the internet, but in terms of interconnectedness. So thank you.
Right, just pick up some other questions. So Saman, you had quite a few questions from your group. Do you want to just pick one?
So 2 of the questions has already been answered. Thank you, David. That was really, really optimistic. The way you talked about digital divide or closing the digital divide, that was very optimistic. Thank you for that. But so that part is answered, and we thoroughly enjoyed this analogy, this comparing AI with electricity, because you mostly talk negative about whenever you introduce electricity to young kids, you introduce it in a negative way. That may not be the case for AI. That shouldn't be the case for AI. That's one comment from my group. So there was one thing about this curriculum, and you have already, you got the funding to develop a curriculum. How soon, potentially, that could happen? A universal, let's say, curriculum for AI education, or how accessible that would be? Are you planning to make it accessible? Something we can use in the UK, basically.
Yeah, so certainly this project for Georgia, this is a NSF funded project. Everything we do will be made publicly available. I don't think there will ever be a universal AI curriculum for the same reason that there's not a universal math curriculum. So other groups are developing materials and courses, and let 1,000 flowers bloom, right? You should have many choices of resources and approaches to draw upon. We're running the first pilot of our middle school elective right now. So we don't have anything to release yet. We're generating slide decks and exercises as we go. We did work with a group of Georgia teachers starting last year to co-design this curriculum. And I think probably after we've done the first pilot, we would likely make public the first draft of the materials so other people can see them and comment on them. So you'll have something to look at. I would say by mid-year, by mid-2022. But you don't have to wait for us. There are other groups doing things now, and as we find good materials, we link to them from the resource guide. So if you could go to AI4K12.org and go to the list of resources, you can find links to things like MIT's RAISE project, ISTE's materials. There are resources out there.
Thank you. That's very useful.
And we're developing a list of resources from these seminars, I've just put it in the chat. Because it's all these resources being shared is lovely. Callum, you had a number of questions in the chat. Do you want to, it was the one about engaging children with theory that I thought might be quite useful to raise on any of your questions from your group.
Okay, yeah, thanks. First, I'd just like to make the point about the first question I said. You said a wee while ago, David, that everybody has smartphones. Okay, broadly true, especially in Western schools, not 100% the case, especially if we're thinking globally. And so the point that was raised by one of the teachers in our group as well is that while some children have Alexa at home and things like that and have interacted with it, that's not going to be the case for all children. So appreciating that diversity of backgrounds and things, as with most things, is important. But coming to the engagement thing, this is a point that was raised of basically kids don't want to learn how it works on the inside as such. They just want to learn how to use it, basically was the general idea I was getting. So how to get people to engage with engage with the sort of lower levels of understanding how things work and not necessarily programming them, like we say. How can we get people interested and engaged in that?
Can I take the first crack at that, Dave?
Sure.
Thanks for that question. I think it's really great for students to be able to use the tool and make things that create behaviors even before they understand really how the thing works. So they can, with machine learning, you can build a system that works, and then you could probe it and see how it breaks. So you could find the limits of what it can do. And then I think people naturally build theories about how to explain those things. So I think with computing technology where kids can make functioning systems, we have a real opportunity to create engagement without having to lead with theory first. So I'm a big fan of theory late, after people have had tacit experiences, particularly at the edges of functionality where things start to fail. I think because then people get really curious what's going on here, and then a teacher can take advantage of that and start to explain things.
Yeah, I agree. That's a very powerful approach. To get at the issue of motivation, one of the things we want kids to do is think about future career paths in STEM, in AI, in robotics. And so just answering, the theoretical question, how does this work, may not be so compelling, but if they think, could I be a person building the next generation of these intelligent robots? Or could I get a job making intelligent agents to help people? Then that motivates them to learn more about the material than if it was just presented as something you need to memorize for the next test.
Lovely. And we're sort of starting to run out of time. So I think there's a few questions from Diallo.
So I work in a university and I just think about, so I teach technology integration courses, but unfortunately what happens is, I'm responsible for teaching everybody about technology, but when they leave my class and go to other methods courses like science methods, language arts methods, children's literature, things like that, none of those professors are into technology. They're into what they do, their discipline. So how will we change that about education programs where all the faculty have some level of tech skills? Would it be workshops for them? Would it be in doctoral programs? Because that's what I see where one of the roadblocks is for students, for teachers anyway, to get a real immersive experience with technology, because they take the one off, but then they don't see embedded, they don't see it embedded in their other courses.
I think we need to find ways for people to see how this technology is useful for them, right? So if you're you can't really be a scientist these days without some level of computing skills, right? It's sort of expected that you have enough computing skills to collect and analyze and publish your data. And so I think that's the secret, right? Is to find some application that's so attractive to people in their field, right? So that, whatever they're doing, you're a plant biologist and you're not, you took some Python class as an undergraduate and you didn't like it very much. And you never wanted to take computing again. But now there's this really cool thing that you could do in plant biology if only you could do data analysis, right? And so now it suddenly becomes compelling to you that, I really want to be able to do this, or all my colleagues are doing this. And if I can't do it, I'm going to be left behind. That's what we need to do, right? We need to find the killer application for people who then see technology as letting them reach their goals. And I think that has to be done piecemeal, right? The plant biologists have to figure out how to do it for their colleagues, and the music teachers have to figure out how to do it for their colleagues. I don't know that an AI expert is smart enough to do that.
Great. I think can we get squeeze one more question in? Stefan, you asked a question about glass boxes. I can't find it now on the chat. Do you want to ask your question? That would definitely be the last one.
Yeah, that's a short one. I think it was David who was talking about that for deep neural networks, there isn't a good representation for students to see what's going on in the black box. But you were mentioning one example where it was possible to see what each neuron was doing. Could you elaborate a bit about that?
Yeah, so there are actually a few demos that will show you let you examine the states of neurons in a deep neural network. A very common example is OCR. So there's a standard data set of handwritten digits, and a very common thing, if you take a neural network, a machine learning course, you learn to train one of these digit recognizers on handwritten digits. And the network's not very deep. It's maybe like 8 layers or so. And you can design a graphical tool that will show you the responses of all the neurons in all the different layers. It's a lot harder to do that for more complex recognition things. So things like a face recognizer. It's not, I mean, you can look at the layer 1 kernels and you'll see edge detectors and color patch detectors, and we've done that for a face recognizer. But when you go into the deeper kernels, it's much harder. So you can display the activations of the neurons. You can see which ones light up, but trying to tell a coherent story about what is this neuron doing, that's much harder. That's a current research project. People are developing tools to try and analyze the activities of these neurons and tell some kind of coherent story about what stimuli they're looking for. But in general, they're going to have response functions that were not designed by some human to be understandable. So the learning algorithm is under no constraint that this should make sense to any human ever. And so there's a limit to how explainable these things could be in principle.
Great. Okay, thanks very much to everybody who's asked a question. And can we say another big round of applause, thanks, jazz hands, whatever, to Fred.
Thanks, everybody. You guys were a great audience. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, great audience. Thank you, audience, and thanks for all the comments in the chat. I think Diana will be able to save it and share it, and all the resources. We're trying to capture all the resources that keep being that people are sharing each seminar, because it's just brilliant. So one little favor from us, we are really trying to evaluate how well these seminars are going. So Diana's put a link up there for our survey, rpf.io/research seminar survey with hyphens. Please do fill it in. It's really helpful to us so that we can make these seminars even better, and find out actually if they have any impacts on anything that you're doing. Also, just to say that we have 2 more seminars in this series. On 1st of February, we'll hear from Tara from Technovation, who's talking about teaching youth to use AI to tackle the Sustainable Development Goals. And then finally, on the 1st of March, we have Stefania Druga from the University of Washington talking about democratizing AI education with and for families. So we've I think in this series covered lots of different topics and angles on AI education. I think it's just been great. So thanks again to Fred and Dave. Thank you to all of you for coming along. For us, it's 6:30 p.m. So we'll be going off to have dinner, and some of you it's the beginning of your day. So have a good day if it's the beginning of your day. Really great to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Diana. Thanks, everybody.
It's been a pleasure.